There is no one thing there. There's an indefinite number of things. You could hold this as a collection of silicon atoms. You could hold it as a weapon. You could hold it as death for an ant.
So we can call it a glass. We wouldn't call it a hamster because it doesn't have that particular set of intercorrelated sensations.
Well, this is a hamster because if you don't feed it, it's not useful. And suppose we start using the word hamster to mean those things that we have to keep on feeding and topping up. And then I would say, oh yes, well, we've got 3 hamsters here. Well, actually 4 there.
I guess I'm kind of confused by the argument here.
Now we're going to start giving speakers an opportunity to put out their pitch to you. And I'm going to turn first to Stephen. Stephen, should we see thought as independent of language? And if so, what does thought consist of?
Well, if thought were independent of language, we wouldn't have any use for language because the whole point of language is to convey ideas. So it's not independent, but it's not the same thing as language. We know it's not the same thing for many reasons. One of them is, how would children learn language to begin with if they were incapable of thinking until they had language? The way that language acquisition has to work is that children have some understanding of the world, of the objects around them, of the intentions of the people that they interact with, and they map them onto the sequences of sounds and gestures that they perceive. Also, we know that there are many forms of thought that are not linguistic, such as visual imagery, such as spatial cognition, such as mental maps, all of which are specialties of Professor Tversky, who I'm sure will enlighten us about those. Even when it comes to the content of language, what we take away after the words have faded is the gist of language, not the words themselves. Within a few seconds after I stop speaking, or with a few minutes after you've read something, you probably could not reproduce a single sentence verbatim, but hopefully you would come away with the content, the meaning, the gist. And one of the most robust findings in our field, cognitive psychology, is that long-term memory for gist is far more robust than memory for text itself. We know from studies of the brain that there are networks of language in the brain that are not the same as the parts of the brain that light up when people are thinking visually, thinking spatially, thinking in terms of motion. Again, to go back to one of Professor Tversky's specializations, we can imagine tying a shoe, we can imagine diving off a board. We have auditory imagery, a song can run through our head, and there are probably other forms of thought that we don't even have names for. We also know that we sometimes struggle to put our thoughts into words. We write down a sentence and we realize, that's not what I meant, and rewrite it until the sentence comes out right. Now, again, this doesn't mean that language is independent of thought. This is one of many false dichotomies in the paragraph that introduced this session. It can't be independent. We also use language as an aid to thought, such as when we have a loop of a string of words running through our minds. Most obviously, when you get a one-time password, when you have to log into a website, comes up in your smartphone and you've got to tap it in. That kind of runs through your head as a little version of your own voice. We use phrases and words as ways of holding things in working memory, so that we don't have to keep abstract ideas of everything active all the time. And if our language has words or phrases, that makes it all that much easier because there's a simple stretch of sound that we could use as a kind of working memory. There are many rich interactions between language and thought. If there weren't, we would not have language to begin with because it's a means of sharing thought, but the language is not the same thing as thought.
Okay. Stephen, thank you. That's got us off to a really great start. And Stephen's urging us to be careful with our terms. Thought as independent of language. Hilary, what do you think? Do you accept that?
Well, I think, as I understand it, Stephen is a powerful and great advocate for what I would see as the Enlightenment version of thought, language, and reality. And as I understand it, Stephen is proposing that language is a means of communicating thoughts, and as he has described, it's not the same thing. It's as it were, largely a vehicle for thoughts, and those thoughts enable us to describe things objectively out in the world. Now, there are lots of points of similarity in terms of our description of the relationship between language and thought. I don't think that language exhausts thought, or that we have to think in language. I think some of the moves of 20th century language philosophers, like the early Wittgenstein, for example, went too far. It was the idea that the limits of my world are the limits of language. It doesn't seem to me right. But and I think there is a significant but, I think that we do have fundamental different ways of holding both thought, language, and the world. And I want to say a little bit about that, because I don't buy what I see as the Enlightenment notion that thought and language can describe what's out there. And therefore, I think we have to have a different account of what reality is, and indeed what language and thought are. So I'm going to start, I'm going to be as quick as I can. It's a pretty giant canvas we've got here. But in terms of language, which is the easiest one to talk about because we are using words to talk about it, I think what we do with language is we hold the world as something. We don't describe the world out there, we hold it as something. Now that may appear to be rather similar, but actually it's fundamentally different. And I don't think that language is the only way that we do this. What we're doing with language is we're creating identities. We're saying, hold it like this. So when you communicate, you say, hold the world like this. And we, in order to do that, we create identities in the way that we frame it. And it's not, language isn't the only way we create identities. I mean, I would say that the sort of processing we have in the brain involves layers of what I call closure, which is the creating of those identities. Closure is the process of creating those identities, starts from the outset. I mean, when you look up, to use neuroscientific vocabulary, when you look out at the world, you take the entirety of the openness of the world, as I would describe it, and your neurons in your eye respond in just one way. They either fire or they don't fire. They're not a description of what's out there. They're just responding to what's out there. And that is like a preliminary closure. It takes all of that stuff and it turns it into one identity, which is the firing of the neuron. And then in further layers of our brain, we have layers of further closure. So we hold hundreds of millions of firings of neurons as, say, a patch of blue. It's not the same thing as the neurons. It's definitely not the same thing as out there. It's a way of holding the world. So what's language and thought? What they do is they hold sensations as one and the same thing. So what we do is we take a variety of different sensations which have got nothing in common with each other, and we hold them as an identity. So if I take this, we hold the look of it, the sound of it, the way that it appears to us. We hold all of those as one thing. In this case, you probably think glass. And we do that through the idea and the language of glass. We hold it as this one thing. But of course, in fact, there is no one thing there. There's an indefinite number of things. You could hold this as a collection of silicon atoms. You could hold it as a weapon. You could hold it as death for an ant. You could hold it in an indefinite number of ways. And that's true of every part of your visual field. You can hold them in an indefinite number of ways. And the ones that we do hold are just sort of social norms, the ones we get used to. Now, you might think that behind all of these different descriptions, there's some ultimate thing that we're describing with language and thought. But I don't think that's the case. If you look for that underlying thing, you can't find it. As scientists have found, you can't find what this is ultimately. Well, maybe it's atoms, then it's protons and neutrons, then it's quarks, then it's fields of energy, then it's mathematics. There's no limit. There's no bottom to our closures. And that's because closures are not descriptions of the stuff out there. So finally, to the question of the relationship between thought and language, both of them are, I would describe technically as intersensory closure. They are the ways that we hold senses as one and the same. But in the case of language, it's like a subset. It's that we hold, in spoken language anyway, that we hold the sound of a word as the same as a prior identity. And that proves to be a very powerful way of closing the world. Doesn't exhaust thought. There are other ways that we can hold different sensations as one and the same. but it is doing essentially the same thing, which is creating intersensory closure.
Stephen, could I bring you in? So earlier, Hilary was saying, like, largely agreeing with your point, like language can give us a lot more precise information about the kind of thing that we're talking about. But then Hilary said, but the idea that there is an ultimate thing in the world is wrong. It doesn't, that's not true. What do you think? I mean, is language, can language refer to an ultimate thing? Is there an ultimate thing that language can grasp for us?
I'm not sure what ultimate thing means, but are there things in the world?
Yeah, things in the world. Perfect.
There are things in the world, and a lot of them have names, and when they don't, we expand the language to name things that previously did not have names. Now, there is, of course, intersensory closure, but if one's curious, why can there be intersensory closure? Why is it that if something has a shape like that's concave, and you put water in, the water doesn't spill out? Well, it's because there is a glass, and the glass has certain properties, and it obeys certain laws. And why is the set of intercorrelated sensations that we call a glass, why do they happen to correlate? Well, one ought to be curious as to why some things correlate and others don't. So we can call it a glass. We wouldn't call it a hamster because it doesn't have that particular set of intercorrelated sensations. And the most parsimonious explanation, the one that is amply confirmed by every test that we make, is there are things out in the world. And science absolutely assumes there are things in the world. I happen to have a copy of a magazine called Science in my lap, and the cover story is about roses, about the mathematics that govern the formation, the shape of rose petals, not the same as what makes petals of a daisy or a tulip. And that's because there are roses out there, and science absolutely makes ontological commitments, not out of stubborn habit, but simply because it's the best explanation for all of the intercorrelated sensations that you can call closure. They close for a reason, namely, there are things out there that in which various properties hang together, and that's why so many of our sensations tend to go together.
So, I mean, as I said at the outset, there are many points in which I absolutely agree with the points that Stephen is making. But I just think you don't need, I think, to have this notion that there is some ultimate bits which validates any particular closure. So you said, well, if someone said this is a hamster, that's obviously ridiculous. Well, suppose I said, well, this is a hamster because if you don't feed it, it's not useful. You have to keep feeding the glass in order to be useful. And suppose we start using the word hamster to mean those things that we have to keep on feeding and topping up. And then I would say, oh yes, well, we've got 3 hamsters here. Well, actually 4 there. And you can do it, can't you? You might think, well, that's not much use, actually. I don't really like that one. But if we used it socially and that became a norm, then it would become a hamster. And that is the nature of all closure, that there's no limit to the number of ways. It's just a random one that Stephen put up. But whatever it is, we can use closures to help us intervene in the world. We don't need the idea that there's a correct one. We refine them. We might, if we called it a hamster, distinguish between, really valuable hamsters and ones which are less valuable. We might be able to ask all sorts of, well, what is the core nature of hamsterdom in this particular case? All of the classic things that we do with all of our definitions. But we just have to give up on the idea that they're pointing to some underlying stuff, which is a reality which is already coming, divided up, and we're just somehow naming it in some way as if there's a right answer.
I guess I'm kind of confused by the argument here. So
was it hamsterdom that lost you, Stephen?
I think you may have lost me. So yes, there's no correct answer as to say whether you're holding a glass or an object. It's both. There's no correct answer as to whether something is a hamster or a rodent or an animal or a living thing. It's all of those, simply because reality itself consists of nested and interrelated categories. But if you hold up the glass and say, this is a hamster, that's a false statement in the sense that a word is a convention. That is, it's a set of coordinated representations in the minds of people who form a language community, who tacitly agree and assume others agree as to what sound is used to correspond to which concept. Now, it can change. Words do change their meaning. But if you were to say today, holding up your glass and saying that this is a hamster, you'd be making a false statement. I mean, you could try to start a movement that we rename glasses hamsters. I don't think we'd get much traction. But it would be a false statement in the sense that it would be contradict the set of coordinated representations in the brains of all the English speakers who have an expectation as to which symbol is going to be used with which concept.
So I just don't think there are that simplicities of truth and falsity you describe. I think that the truth that you're identifying there is a very embedded social norm. It is absolutely true. We normally think of this as a glass, but the other examples I've given you are absolutely ones that we could employ instead. And I think it's possible.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.